Transistor Radio.
You're listening to Transistor Radio. I'm your host, Darren Franz. My website is theageoftransitions.com. Please go to The Age of Transitions to subscribe to this podcast. Listen to past episodes. You can download the podcast directly from theageoftransitions.com. You can also subscribe through iTunes, other various methods like that. Also have articles and videos posted on the site, so please go to theageoftransitions.com. Today again on the show we have a guest with us. So it's a repeat guest, and he's been here many times before. I'm very excited to have him again. It's always a great conversation. He runs a website called investigatingtheterror.com. He actually has a new website too we'll have to talk a little bit about. And he has a new book coming out, a book about 7/7 bombings. So that ancient history of 7/7. The book is called Secrets, Spies, and 7/7. So I would like to welcome once again to the show, Tom Secker.
Hey Aaron, it's good to be back with you.
Yes, it's always fun to speak with you. We always have good conversations, so I know that the audience will enjoy this podcast as always. I'd like to start out by asking you a little bit about the book. Just a simple first question. What was the inspiration to write this book, to create it?
Well, I suppose it's that I'd made two documentaries, two sort of feature-length, full-length documentaries about 7/7, and having got a lot of feedback from that, and having managed to get quite a lot of people to watch them, they were reasonably successful films. Well, they still getting watched by more people. I just felt that there needed to be a really good 7/7 book, and one that didn't just look at the kind of the bombings themselves and focused on the day itself, but looked at what was going on around this attack, and both in the years beforehand and the years after, and just gave a kind of overview of, if you like, the trajectory of this event and the fallout from this event in particular. And just kind of, there wasn't another book out there that did this, and I felt it should exist, so I wrote it.
That's good, because it's one thing just to analyze the event, and then we have this piece of evidence, we have that, this doesn't add up, that doesn't add up. But you're right, there's these sorts of news stories, these events take on a life of their own, and then they go off in additional directions. So that's exactly what you're doing here. So that's wonderful. And your book is divided up into 3 sections. Looks as though the first section is specifically about 7/7, the event itself, getting into the evidence there. Section 2 is entitled Intelligence Failures, and Section 3, Conspiracy in Context. You just elaborate on the 3 parts of the book there?
Well, I mean, technically those section headings never actually made it into the final version of the book, but you're right. The first few chapters are basically concerned with the event itself, in terms of first chapter is all about the news coverage of the day of 7/7 and how there was this sort of mass confusion about everything from how many bombs had gone off to which direction these trains and this bus was going in, and how they got to where they were when the explosions happened, and what had actually caused the explosions. Was this some kind of horrendous electrical accident or a terrorist attack or whatever? And amidst all this confusion, the official story, this notion of Muslim suicide bombings, Muslim radical suicide bombers, emerged so quickly on both sides of the Atlantic. On the evening of 7/7, you have commentators from the BBC and Fox News talking about suicide bombers before anyone had any kind of evidence for that. So there's that kind of phenomenon is what I was looking at in the opening chapter. Then I had a look at some of the other stuff that's been kind of put out there in terms of notions of a wider conspiracy. The official story basically says that it was just these 4 guys that did it and they acted alone. But at various times they've kind of hung these mysterious figures out there, these so-called masterminds out there in the public, that, to be honest, all of which I think are diversions, really. I think they're kind of fluff and nonsense, smoke and mirrors. So that's what the second chapter looks at. The third one's all about the CCTV, and there's some very suspicious stuff in the CCTV that I strongly recommend people actually watch that CCTV footage, because there's a remarkable amount of stuff that I think quite a lot of people have just missed.
Yeah, I was looking at that section yesterday, actually, and you pointed out the fact that some folks called out the CCTV footage as fake, but then it kind of recanted later when useful evidence popped up from it, so it's kind of changing stories back and forth.
Yeah, a lot of the alternative theorists, the skeptics of the official story, a lot of them were just branding all of this CCTV evidence as, it's all a hoax, it's all been done in Photoshop, whatever. And I don't think it was. It's not particularly good quality video, but it is a CCTV camera. Anyone who's ever worked with a CCTV camera knows those systems are far from perfect. And yeah, when the July 7th Truth campaign spotted this kind of mysterious car that looks very like the sort of car an MI5 agent would drive.
yeah, it's like a fancy car, yeah.
Yeah, it's a Jaguar. It's, it's quite a posh car, sort of, spookmobile or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's parked in the corner of this Luton train station car park on 2 separate days at the exact same time as these guys are turning up supposedly as part of their plan to bomb London. And the way that the video is edited, and the fact that the cameras outside the station have been mysteriously moved from the first day that it caught the guys and this mysterious car to the second day, the cameras have actually been moved in between those 2 days. And all of this suggests that they've tried to obscure the movements of this Jaguar car and to try and stop people from spotting it. All of which is extremely suspicious, particularly when you add in the fact that geographically, when you... It's a little difficult to explain without having the video in front of me, but basically the car is parked in as far away from the entrance to the station as it possibly could be. So the notion that it was just there to pick someone up or drop someone off, like, any other car would be there, doesn't make much sense. But when I was kind of having a little bit of a scan around Luton Station car park on Google Maps and on Google Street View, and I noticed that area of the car park where this mysterious car is parked is actually much higher up. It sort of slopes up towards that part. So from that point, you can actually see over the whole of the car park and the whole of the entrance to the station. It's the ideal sort of surveillance point or vantage point, and that's the only logical reason, to my mind, why the car would be there, all of which is very, very suspicious, because officially there is no wider conspiracy, there is no one else involved. Well, if there's no one else involved, and who are these people sat in this car at the exact same time as these so-called suicide bombers? And as soon as that discovery was made, a lot of people who'd previously said, oh, there's nothing to see in the CCTV, flipped around and said, oh, there's lots of things to see in the CCTV, and it all conveniently fits in with what we've already been saying. And I just found it kind of a bit intellectually dishonest, so I felt it warranted pointing out in the book.
Well, as we've said before on the show, we've had conversations about this before, and it's very important that you have to keep asking questions. You have to be highly critical, and you have to be critical of the critics too when they kind of fall short and they're not changing their mind or when they're sticking to a piece of evidence that's shaky and they don't seem to want to leave that piece of shaky evidence for whatever reasons. So you get into this heavily in the book.
Well, specifically what they tried to, I'm not going to name the individuals because this isn't about individuals really, but what they tried to do was say that this mysterious Jaguar that looks like it's got some spooks riding around in it was something to do with this Peter Power training exercise that was going on the morning of 7/7, and that potentially even that Peter Power was driving the Jaguar. And it just, it's so tenuous that all you've got is a mystery car, and that every reason to find that car suspicious. No dispute about that. But we don't know who was in it. I'm only saying it, that it's a bit spooky, or chances are it's Spies, because I suppose because of the aesthetics of the car, the way the car looks, and just because of the whole thing just has that kind of feel about it. I don't have any real evidence that it was MI5 inside that car, but they, this sort of little clique of people who'd been going around saying the CCTV was fake, all then instantly turned around and said, "Oh, it's Peter Bauer in the car. It's Peter Bauer in the Jaguar. That's all the Jaguar is. That's what it's there for. That's what this is about." And it's just, they were kind of subsuming it under their desired theory. They didn't feel any obligation to sort of review their theory in light of this. They just thought, what's the quickest, easiest way to subsume it under that, and just file it under miscellaneous Peter Bauer stuff.
Yeah. Well, it points out another thing too, where their focus is on Peter Bauer because he becomes their guy of interest. So they're like, okay, Peter Bauer's obviously the one involved in this. So then you just look for anything, even if perhaps certain people aren't even really the ones that we should be looking at. And you've talked about how Peter Bauer himself may be a diversionary figure, and there are such things.
Well, absolutely. I think at this stage, that's the most likely explanation for what the connection is between that exercise that Peter Bauer was running that morning and the real attack. Is not that it was in any way directly involved in carrying out the attack, but that it was I suppose, set up as part of the media coverage of the event. I mean, after all, the only reason we know about this exercise he was running that morning is because he went on TV and told everyone. And that suggests, from the off, that suggests to me that there's a psychological motive involved here rather than a operational one. And then if you get into the whole question of this ties in with the predictive programming aspect, and it also ties in with a string of training exercises that were being run prior to 7/7, and there is a sort of quite a lot of crossover thematically, quite a lot of crossover between the exercises and the TV programs, the predictive TV programs. So, I mean, do you want me to give a kind of quick rundown of what all that's about?
Yeah, exactly. So, in the book, you have a chapter dedicated, I believe, to predictive programming. So, of course, listeners to this podcast are familiar with the idea, but just review it anyway, and let us know how it relates to the 7/7 case.
Well, to my mind, the most important thing in aspect of predictive programming is that it uses narrative to shape people's, I suppose, expectations and anticipations of the future. It predicts events, but it also predicts the response to those events and therefore conditions the response to those events. And to give you an example of what I mean, there is a recurring theme in British television programs that were about spying and terrorism in between 9/11 and 7/7. All of these programs broadcast on the BBC, and there's maybe a dozen or more. And there are recurring memes, such as an attack on the London Underground, such as Islamic suicide bombers, such as terrorists being shot dead in response to this event. And what we were given sort of over and over again was the official story of Islamic suicide bombers, the official security state response, which was, we need to have armed police basically shooting people dead to stop them in case they might be suicide bombers. And we saw this shortly after 7/7, but it was shown on television several times before 7/7, so that when they actually went onto this tube train a couple of weeks after 7/7, chasing this guy who was completely innocent, Jean-Charles de Menezes was completely innocent, but they went onto this train, they said they thought he was a suicide bomber and they shot him dead. And as a result of that, people kind of accepted it. A lot of people just accepted that the police basically just murdered this innocent guy. And part of the reason why they accepted that was because they had been preconditioned by these television programs to think this is the necessary response to a suicide bombing. The flip side of that predictive programming phenomenon, if you like, is that we also got this alternative conspiracy theory. We got this whole thing to do with exercises, that there was some kind of exercise related to the real attack, and this occurs in at least 2 different television shows as a storyline, as a fictional storyline, and it also appears in another couple of television shows as a sort of if you like, as just the premise of the TV show, that they were having a sort of simulated terrorist attack and they would see how they would respond to it. So we didn't just get kind of the official version and the official violent security state response to the attack. We also got this, what I think is a kind of diversionary alternative version. All of this predicted, all of this conditioned well in advance, well before Peter Bauer ever even went on TV and said a word about anything. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that those few minutes of media interviews with Peter Bauer became the basis for such a sort of outlandish and wide-ranging alternative theory of the events, is because people were being told, not quite subliminally, but implicitly, before the event, that this was what was going to happen, and therefore this is the direction they should be looking in.
Yeah, this is an area that I find more and more fascinating as time goes on, is predictive programming as it relates to the alternative. So predictive programming specifically tailor-made for the alternative media and its audience. And it's what more do you feel about just that general reality of that brand, I guess you'd call it, of predictive programming?
Well, in this case, like I say, there's a lot of crossover between the TV shows and the real boots-on-the-ground training exercises and the desktop training exercises, because you have all these TV shows being broadcast between 2001 and 2005. You also have a run of training simulations of some sort, and there's a chapter in the book that outlines each one of these and the documentation for them, which also, in many respects, predicted 7/7. And predicted the official version, the version of, suicide bombers. And since you have both of these going on at the same time, I was starting to wonder, if you like, whether the exercises themselves were a form of preconditioning, were a form of predictive programming, if you like, in as much as some of these exercises, there was particularly one called Atlantic Blue. In this country, it was called Atlantic Blue, but it was a international simulated terrorist attack training exercise that went on for about a week. And this is a couple of months before 7/7. And it was also being run in the US under the title Top Off 3, and in Canada under the title Triple Play. And in this country, it was a kind of locked room simulation thing where they got thousands of people involved in all of this, but there wasn't anyone actually running around on the streets pretending to be responding to a real bombing. It was all a sort of command post thing. It was, we feed people information and they have to make decisions about how to respond. And the scenario for it was bombs on underground trains and buses. So the scenario directly predicts 7/7 in that respect. But the most important thing to my mind about this whole Atlantic Blue thing is the use of fake media, pseudo-media, i.e. they produced synthetic rolling news coverage of these fictitious events that weren't really happening, but that they were pretending were happening so they could respond to them. Now, one of the documents that's in the back of the book, it's on page 314, for anyone who has a copy of the book or gets a copy of the book. I included a document from this Atlantic Blue training exercise. It's from a sort of internal publication inside the Home Office who were actually running this drill. And it's basically an interview with one of the people who was responsible for producing these fake news broadcasts. You can actually find some of the video of this online and stuff. It's absolutely fascinating to watch, because they were using like real news presenters and real news commentators, and in some cases real officials, to comment on events that weren't really happening. So you can kind of see that they're mixing between the simulation and the reality. Yeah. And in particular, in this document I include in the book, one of these people who was making this fake news, they call it pseudo-media, and they call them pseudo-journalists.
Yeah, the document's actually labeled as such. I'm looking at my copy right now. It says the PseudoMedia Effect on this document.
And this is internal Home Office stuff. It's official as official as it gets. And the person actually says that the purpose of all of this was to basically give them information in real time, and they use the phrase "and drive player actions accordingly." Now, what I interpret that to mean is that they were feeding them information to see how they would respond to it. And that was the primary purpose of this exercise. It wasn't actually to, if you like, test what would happen in a real event. It was more about testing out, if we tell them this, then how do they respond? If we tell them something different, then how do they respond differently?
Huh. That's
and
wild.
So you see it's kind of, caught up in the same kind of process that predictive programming is for us. This was like a predictive programming for the emergency response services, whereas, Spooks and these other BBC television shows are predictive programming for the mass public and, I suppose you would say, the alternative public. Yeah. And you see it functions in much the same way. So what's the upshot of this? The upshot of this is that they're blurring reality and simulation. That's the thing that I find particularly insidious. It's not just that they're kind of seeding conspiracy theories, both official and alternative, before anything even happens. It's that they're actually playing against people's confusion and people's sense of dislocation, and the fact that we live in this mass media environment where we experience mediated reality more often in a lot of cases than we experience actual, real, physical reality. And so, of course, then when people hear on 7/7, oh, we were running this simulation, we were running this exercise, they start to think, oh, the simulation's the reality and the reality is the simulation. And they get all confused. And in the midst of all that confusion, they think, oh, it must all be about this guy and then this guy who was running the exercise. And, of course, you could not come up with a more perfect distraction than that from what I think was really going on. Yeah. So that's where I think all that's going. And that's what sort of the case I make in the book, that this is a kind of ontological sleight of hand, if you like.
That's amazing. It's a drill more for the psychological operation than for the actual operation itself. And it's again with the book, it's very cool that you have this section of documents, which is very large. You have a very large section of documents to back up what you're saying, to as examples to show people where you got your information and to help them out. So that's a good aspect of the book. And this one in particular is very interesting. It's a little piece of help us understand the psychological operations. And that's, to me, that's what these large terror events come down to. That's their most important aspect. Of course, they're real events, but their psychological effect is really the main thrust for having them occur in the first place, really.
Yeah, I think so, because not to in any way trivialize or diminish the fact that real people die in these events.
No.
But the point of a terrorist attack is not just to kill some people. The point of a terrorist attack, whoever's carrying it out, is to have an impact on the people who survive, is to essentially scare them and scare them into doing something that they wouldn't otherwise do, or accepting something that they wouldn't otherwise accept. And if you read, CIA analyses of the impact of terrorist attacks, this is exactly what they say. They recognize this better than the terrorists do. I mean, I know the CIA are deeply involved in terrorism, but you know what I'm saying. They get this. They understand that better than any sort of, random freedom fighter radical who might be fighting in any country across the world. It's the intelligence services who grasp that the most and the most sort of acutely. And I think there is. I also point this out in the book, that when you look at the big boots on the ground exercises that they were doing, where, they get the emergency gear on and the face masks and the air tanks and everything, and they go sort of marching around pretending there's a load of poison gas or whatever. These exercises are always farcical in terms of their actual physical preparation for an attack. They usually hold them on a Sunday, whereas, no one carries out a terrorist attack on a Sunday, do they? They usually, pay no attention to which direction the wind's blowing, and it turns out, if there was actually some poison gas, then half of the people would have died. And, they're absolutely ridiculous. They don't give you any real life preparation for what's really going on. And in particular, with 7/7, you notice this because The emergency service radios didn't work on large sections of the London Underground, the underground train network. And they knew about this, and they knew about this from exercises from years ago, and they even knew about this from events on the Underground from years ago, and they didn't fix it. So clearly these exercises weren't about actually preparing the emergency services for an event in the sense of we want them to respond efficiently and effectively and save lives. Because if they were trying to do that, they would have fixed the bloody radios, wouldn't they? But they didn't. Instead, they were more focused on creating days and days of fake media to feed to people to see what they made of it.
Yeah.
So what does that tell you? Like you say, it tells you this is about psychological impact first and foremost.
Well, they also work on a principle that they know works, which is just pure spectacle. If you've got a spectacle for people to look at, then people will automatically assume, oh, this is a big event. Look at this. Things are happening. There's no critical thinking. It's just like, wow, this is impressive. A bunch of guys in full gear running around. They must be doing something. Right?
And this applies as much to media coverage, mass media coverage of these exercises as it does to fictional TV shows or to real events, for that matter. That's the thing. They can induce that response in people, whether it's a simulation or a reality. And that's quite dangerous to us, because that means you could get to the point where people are flicking through the channels, they see this thing on the news, and they don't know whether this is an exercise or a real attack, because quite often they've got people being interviewed during these exercises talking as though this is really happening, and like I say, it just sort of muddles up with people's faculties, and it's almost an assault on their ability to distinguish between fact and fantasy.
Yeah, brilliant. Definitely. I mean, that's a strange age we live in, for sure. As you were saying before, we tend not to even experience life so much in the real world as we do media. So all this spectacle being put out for whatever reason, it's all it's as if we ourselves are living it. So this all becomes part of our shared experience.
Mm.
I mean,
and sorry.
No. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, like you were saying about this being a spectacle, in particular with 7/7, it's so different to 9/11, because 9/11 was, it's up in the skies, it's planes crashing into buildings, it's, automatically the most eye-catching thing that happened that day. With 7/7, of course, the timeline of events is that shortly before 9 a.m., you get 3 different explosions, or at least 3 different explosions on underground trains. But no one sees any of this happening because it's all happening underground. So you hear about it. Again, you hear about it. They start having a conversation about it before anyone's actually seen anything. And then about an hour later, bang, you get an explosion on a bus. And this is one of those things that I think sort of quite conclusively proves that this wasn't these 4 guys. And that's that the explosions on the trains and the explosion on the bus behave very differently. And let me just qualify that remark. On the trains, although we haven't seen any of these carriages, and we've seen very, very few photos and video footage from inside them after the explosions, all of the witness accounts basically say that they caused huge holes to be blown in the floors, and quite a lot of people say there were multiple holes blown in the floors of these carriages, and in some of these trains you've even got holes being blown in the adjacent carriage to the bomb. How does that work? From one small backpack bomb, that doesn't add up.
Yeah.
But anyway, you're talking about massive destruction. You're talking about, metal trains being ripped apart. On the bus, there's one explosion on the upper deck. It doesn't create any hole in the floor. Now, the floor of the upper deck of a bus is made of, some plywood or something. It's not very strong. If you set off a bomb that can blow through metal on it, it's going to blow through it. But instead, it blows the roof off the bus forward. And yet, everyone on the bus who was sort of killed by being blasted off it flew backwards. So what's this explosion on the bus? It doesn't blow a hole in the floor, even though they're saying the bomb was on the floor. It manages to blow the roof off forwards, but manages to throw all the people backwards. Doesn't make any sense to me. And it certainly doesn't match up with the sort of explosion that happened on the tube train. So to my mind, those are just different explosions being caused by different means. They have to be. Anyway, the point I was getting to was that the bus is the spectacle. The bus is the point at which people see this blown-up bus on the news, and suddenly that's the shocking image. That is the image that people identify with 7/7 most foremost, just in the same way that it's the plane hitting the South Tower on 9/11. That's the image that most people remember. And that's the spectacle. That's the sort of grand explosion. And like you say, people just sort of see that, and it almost mystifies them into being incapable of using any critical faculties. Because if they did, they would have seen all of these things that I just said. They would have seen that there was no hole in this upper deck of the bus. They would have seen that, all these bodies are being blown backwards, but the roof's being blown forwards. They would have seen that there was people stood on the top deck of this bus only a few feet away who weren't injured, and that therefore something's not quite right about this. Something's not adding up about this event. But most people missed that, because most people just saw this sort of horrible thing happening, and I assume quite a lot of people just looked away. Quite a lot of people didn't want to think about it, but by that point it's seared into their mind as a traumatic image, and that's therefore the response that they have to it, is to feel sort of slightly traumatized.
Yeah, perfectly natural. That's a good point that you made with the trains to the buses there, where the trains were just not even a visual thing. It was just it was sort of the precursor to what became the event for people to imprint in their minds, was this murmur, this buzz. So in a way, it's of course it was likely playing on earlier predictive programming too, that but even before the event. But when the event happens, it's kind of like it rolls into it, and you hear about it. So you hear, and this happened with 9/11 too, because everybody heard. I remember I first heard from somebody. Somebody said that a plane hit the World Trade Center. I was like, what does that mean? And immediately I thought back to, was it like the 1920s or something, where some plane ran into the Empire State Building? I'm like, oh, that happened again? That's weird. It's odd. But then they go, then eventually a TV comes on and you go, oh, this is it. So it's almost like this sort of like you're dropping into. Well, what do you think about that aspect, the sort of like lead into it?
The sort of theatrical lead in, yeah. I think you're right that there is something of that at play on both 9/11 and 7/7. And remember, going back to the very first chapter of the book, on the morning of 7/7, you have all these reports of explosions or bangs or something on the underground, and a lot of people are talking about this as some kind of electrical accident. They were talking about a power surge. Now, if you take the phrase power surge out of its electrical context, you maybe get a slightly bigger hint as to what's really going on here. But that's something that the July 7th Truth campaign pointed out, and I've thought, they're spot on with that. Why is it that, for about an hour, all we were hearing was power surge, power surge, power surge, power surge, power surge? It's because there was a surge of power, but not electrical power. But yeah, and that's what we were hearing. But of course, because lots of people had seen all these television programs and seen these training exercises and what have you, a lot of people, their initial reaction was, this isn't going to turn out to be some electrical thing. This is going to turn out to be a terrorist attack. And quite naturally, to be honest, as I remember, I could be misremembering this because we're talking several years ago now, but as I remember, when I turned on the radio and started hearing about, there's been some big incident on the London Underground, and they're talking about the electrical system, my initial reaction was, this is going to end up being a terrorist attack. As I remember, my logic was, even if it isn't a terrorist attack, they're going to call it one. Because even by that point, I was pretty suspicious of what was going on. And yeah, the point at which everyone then sort of realized and accepted and confirmed that this was a terrorist attack was the bus explosion. But by that point, it was almost like a, see, I told you so. That was kind of, because we'd had the lead-in, and because you'd had all the predictive programming telling you this lead-in is going to turn out to be something else, there's going to be a twist in the tail. When the twist happens and the bus explodes and appears on TV, and it becomes apparent that this is some sort of bombing, of course, quite a lot of people will have thought, well, that's what I thought an hour ago. So that's the kind of impact it has on people. And therefore, of course, they're then, from that, going to accept the official story, or most of them are, because they're going to sort of get this sense of inevitability.
Yeah.
Like, I suspected this was the case because the suspicion had been planted in me through years and years of conditioning. But I had this suspicion that this was going to happen. Oh, and then now it's been proved that, I was right about that. And then they start talking about Muslims and suicide bombers and Al-Qaeda and all the rest of it. And people just sort of go, see, that's what I thought. Yeah. And that's how people really think. And that's how, I'm not trying to be patronizing or condescending here, but, we've all spent time around people who actually talk like that and actually think like that. And it's understandable because they're bombarded with this stuff. So, of course, that's the kind of reaction that you're going to be able to generate in quite a lot of people.
Yeah, we've all acted like that ourselves at one point or another. And it's just like a natural reaction to everything you've been inundated with. And another point on the alternative side of everything is I feel as though when you get deep into the conspiracy or whatever, one natural reaction to accepting that alternative view of history, of events just in general, is a sort of cynicism and a sort of defeat, a feeling of defeat, like, oh, well, here's another example of this, like, well, no, this is just always what happens, this is how it goes. Like, do you feel that this is the case, and that perhaps it by getting people to accept an alternative view of things, it's not empowering, but potentially disempowering for individual people?
I think it is. I think you're right. Just as that phenomenon was going on that I was just talking about with the official story, you do have a similar kind of thing going on with the alternative story, with this whole Peter Power fixation, and this whole obsession with the exercise that he was running. And I suppose I've seen this more and more since then, since 7/7, I must admit, but it was at play on 7/7 as well, that as soon as people heard about this interview where this guy had said, I was running an exercise this morning based on a very, very similar scenario to what really happened, that a lot of people just went, this is just like 9/11, because they were running the exercises on the morning of 9/11. They didn't stop to think, hang on, is there a difference between the NORAD, the United States, North American Air Force, running an exercise, and some random management consultant running an exercise? They just heard exercise, drew the parallel, and went, see, it's just like on 9/11, this is what they always do, therefore this is just another false flag, and that's that. And that is disempowering, partly because no one's ever really come up with any solid evidence against Peter Power. No one's found any real corroboration from other people involved in this exercise that there was anything particularly dodgy about it. No one's found any solid evidence that it wasn't, as Peter Bauer certainly now claims, just some kind of desktop thing, half a dozen people in a room with a PowerPoint presentation. That's what Peter Bauer's saying it is. No one's ever really found any solid evidence that he's lying there. So there isn't really much of a case against him. So in what way does believing in all that empower us? I don't think it really does. And I think there's a whole other sort of story going on here that's a much better explanation and a much better evidenced explanation of how these four guys were set up, that has nothing to do with Peter Power, but has been largely ignored because of that fixation on him. So it's disempowering in that way as well. It sort of hinders the alternative movement's ability to investigate this. And ultimately, kind of, isn't that the point? Isn't that what we're here for? What's the point of having an alternative media if not to investigate incidents of mass murder that we're either sort of probably or certainly being lied to about? I mean, proving the official story isn't true is perfectly valid objective. I'm not saying it isn't. But what's left after that? Well, what's left after that is, if not trying to catch the people who did this, at least trying to make a good case against them, at least trying to present a good argument that, there's some other culprits who are still out there and that almost certainly had an involvement in this. And the reason I say this is because I also devote 3 chapters of the book, the middle section of the book, if you like, to this whole question of what they call intelligence failures, which is just a kind of, again, it's a mask, it's theatrical. These weren't intelligence failures, not to my mind. These were deliberate. These were, whenever information wasn't shared before 7/7 about one of these four guys that supposedly did it, but didn't do it, whenever sort of information wasn't shared or wasn't followed up, or someone attempted to investigate but hit a brick wall about them when they shouldn't have done, they should have been able to find more info. You know, every single time that this seemed to happen for a period of 4.5 years, probably more than 4.5 years, it had the effect of not just kind of preventing MI5 from stopping these four guys, what supposedly became suicide bombers. It also kind of covered the trail of three men who are all likely spies. And in fact, one of them is certainly an American spy. The other two are British spies, probably. And that case, to my mind, is the far stronger case against the security services, against the state, against the government, that they had some kind of involvement in this. There's a lot more evidence of that than there is of anything involving Peter Power. And I think it's far more empowering to take on MI5 than it is to take on some random management consultant, to be honest, if you're with me.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I mean, you know, pick a good target, why not? My target's MI5 in this game, and, you know, frankly, I think they're a lot more damaging and a lot more worthy of my attention.
So the alleged bombers have intelligence ties, is that correct? Or you're saying that's the case?
Yeah, basically that they, for this period of about 4.5 years before 7/7, they were getting involved in superficially incriminating activities. Like they went on a camping trip to the Lake District where they were doing kind of quasi-military training. They were involved in a radical bookshop. One of them actually went off to Afghanistan to get some sort of terrorism training there, but it was pretty minimal. It was just, you know, firing a rifle at some rocks or something. And every time they did one of these things, in particular Mohammed Sadiq Khan, who is supposedly the ringleader of this plot, every time he did any of these things, he did it through connection with one of three men, a guy called Martin McDade, a guy called Mohammed Koyum Khan, who's known as Q, and this American guy, Mohammed Junaid Babar, who is certainly a spy. It's the FBI have made statements that can only really be interpreted to mean that he's a spy. Babar was running the training camp in Pakistan. McDade was running this training trip to the Lake District and this radical Islamic bookshop. This other guy, Q, was sort of liaising throughout all of this and was kind of provoking and pushing Mohammed Sadiq Khan to do these things and to get involved with these people. And each one of them, well, two of them have disappeared off the map. McDade and Q no one knows where they are anymore. Junaid Babar was eventually sort of brought to ground, but he then pleaded guilty to basically being an international terrorist. He pleaded guilty to supplying money and equipment to Al-Qaeda and providing terrorism training and all of these different things. And they gave him 4.5 years in prison and then let him out. So I'm saying all of these three guys were spies, and the pattern of intelligence failures, or so-called intelligence failures, stayed out on the streets. Hello?
Oh, so sorry, I just lost you for a second. Continue.
Yeah, the pattern of so-called intelligence failures means that these three guys basically stayed out on the streets doing what they were doing, but also that MI5 didn't have much information on them. It was, like I say, it was like they were preemptively covering the trail of these three guys. And two of them, we didn't even know their names until, well, actually, I think all three of them, we didn't know their names until a couple of years after 7/7. Oh, no, McDade did appear in a newspaper. But the other two we didn't know about until at least a couple of years later. And part of the reason for this is because of these so-called failings. And I can't help but think, there's a link chart that I put together on all of this for my website, investigatingtheterror.com. If you go there and search under 7/7 link chart, or just search on any search engine 7/7 link chart, it'll come up. And what you notice with this, like I say, is every single time one of these alleged bombers ends up doing something incriminating, he does it in contact with one of these three probable spies. Every time MI5 fail to figure this out, and every time they manage to let the four alleged bombers go and these three supposed spies go, And none of these 3 spies, as far as I can tell, ever actually met each other face to face. Now, doesn't that sound like a sort of compartmentalized black operation? Isn't that just sort of what's kind of jumping out at you when you hear this kind of thing and when you see all this?
Well, Skype did just cut out, so perhaps we're onto something here.
Yeah, we did have a couple of Skype problems there. I mean, like I say, if I'm not making an awful lot of sense about this, because it's a difficult thing, it's a complex thing to try and simplify.
Well, no. These are excellent points. These guys did not come out of. They're not just like these average Joes that were just up until the bombing, just hanging out with their family, eating pizza on the weekend, things like that. They were involved in suspicious activity, incriminating activity, to say the least.
Or at least activity that was after 7/7 used to incriminate them. And that's kind of another reason why I think this is a bit of spook theatre, is because MI5 are engaging in a total doublethink over this, right? They're saying, oh, we had all this information before 7/7. We knew that Sadiq Khan was sort of involved with some of these people. But none of that told us that he was going to become a suicide bomber. None of that gave us a reason to investigate him. So you can't blame us for failing to stop him. But all of this stuff is really incriminating, and you should take it as proof that he was a suicide bomber. You shouldn't in any way doubt that. So what are they saying? They're saying that they didn't believe it proved he was a suicide bomber, but we should. Like I say, it's a contradiction. It's a doublethink. It's a trick. Is what I think they're playing here.
Well, you've made the point that this sort of narrative plays into what the intelligence services may want, in that they ask for more powers, more ability to surveil the public, et cetera, in order that future intelligence failures don't happen. They need to be able to gather more evidence so that, there will be no shadow of a doubt next time, and we won't allow this to happen next time, when inevitably there is always a next time and the same story pops up again.
Well, and again, they engage in a doublethink with that, because, like you say, they turn this whole intelligence failures story, and I think intelligence failures are usually, not always, but usually a sort of code word for there's some kind of covert operation going on here. They always say, oh, we didn't chase up these people because we didn't have the resources, we didn't have enough manpower, we didn't have enough money, we didn't have enough access to information about them, we weren't allowed to hack their computer or bug their phone or something. So therefore we should be able to do all this, and we should be able to do all this to absolutely anyone who does anything remotely suspicious, and that's going to be our answer to trying to stop terrorist attacks. And they say, and if you don't give us this, then, well, you can't really blame us next time when there's a terrorist attack, because, it was your fault for not letting us do all this and not giving us this money. But at the same time, they keep telling us another attack is inevitable. There will be another attack. We can't stop everything. There will certainly, security is never absolute. And it's sort of, make up your mind, will you? Or at least, or don't make up your mind. Just shut up and go away. Because frankly, you're not making anyone's life any safer in reality. Let's get away from all the spook theatre for a moment and get back to reality. And the fact is, these people aren't making our lives safer. We can give them as much money and as much legal authority and power as we want. They aren't going to make our lives safer. That's simply not the answer. But that's always the answer, and the only answer that they present to us when something like this happens.
Yeah. I mean, it's clear that as more and more rights are given away by the public, are lost by the public, more and more of these events seem to happen. So they just continue to occur. So as you're saying, we don't appear to be gaining much anything from this.
I don't think we are, no. I don't think any public ever really gains much from having a permanent security state. I don't see that it's ever worked anywhere throughout the whole of history. So I think it's had a good run-in period. I think we've had a couple of millennia at least of this sort of thing, and all we seem to get is more violence and more miscarriages of justice and more lies and more the wrong people being blamed for things, and the more destruction and the more people hating each other and being pitched against one another, all of which just takes us away from reality. It takes us away from the natural world. It takes us away from each other. It takes us away from all the things that are actually the basis for a proper society and a proper civilization, and for just a proper, humans interacting with each other. And like you say, the impact of terrorist attacks is primarily psychological, and it's that psychology of violence, therefore fear, therefore security. That's their trick. That's the one that, regardless of what the actual attack looks like, or regardless of the extent of the predictive programming, or any of the different things that we could kind of the nature of the intelligence failures, whatever, any of these things that we could pluck out that are sort of different from event to event to some extent. But what's always the case is there's some horrible violence, therefore we should be frightened, therefore we accept greater security. And that's the dynamic that we need to break. We just need to break with it mentally more than anything else. Because I don't know that there's an awful lot we can do to physically stop the march of the security state, because I think if you do that, you end up getting shot. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to end up shot, so I'm not going to go and break into MI5. No. Much as I'd like to, Aaron, much as I'd like to, I'm not going to do it because I know where that ends. But what I can do, and what other people can do, and what I hope ultimately this book helps people do, is to understand all of this and therefore be able to recognize it and not fall into that trap, and therefore not become frightened when these things happen, and not just accept more security when these things happen, and not feel the need to sort of say, oh, it's something horrifying and traumatizing, therefore some authority has to do something about it. Okay, these people died, and that's horrible and terrible for those people, and they're bereaved, and their loved ones and everything, but it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that terrible for the whole society. Not to the extent that we should accept changing that whole society and changing the values that are the basis for that society. So that's the thing that we need to sort of keep in mind, is basically, it's called terrorism for a reason. It's trying to terrorize you. So just don't be terrorized. Just kind of try and stay as calm as possible.
There you go. Yeah, good antidote to it there. And so obviously your book, Secrets, Spies, and 7/7 is going to be a very good reference book for people who want to really gain insight into this terrorist event, 7/7. So it'll be a good book to have on hand. It'll be something that you can go to on your bookshelf if you ever, because inevitably you're going to forget points. You're like, oh wait, how'd that one aspect work? So you go to the bookshelf, pull off Secret Spy 7/7, and you look in the index, and you're okay, oh yeah, that's right, now I remember. So it'll be handy for people to have. I also wanted to mention your new website, because it's along these same lines. What's the new website? Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, sure. Well, my sort of longer-term website, the one that's been around for a while, Investigating the Terror, is all about terrorist events and the role that intelligence services play in them, whether we're talking about predictive programming, whether we're talking about spies and agents provocateurs or whatever. But I did feel that the whole relationship between the culture industries and the intelligence services, not just as it relates to terrorist attacks, but as it relates to the sort of broader trajectory of the intelligence services, the march of the security state that I keep mentioning, I felt that was a subject that warranted, I suppose, its own website, basically. So I set up a website called spyculture.com, and it's just all about, spy films, spy books, in particular those where someone who was involved in either writing it or making it is connected with the intelligence services. Either they're a spy, or they're being spied on, or at least they're friends with some spies, or they're part of those sorts of social circles and those sorts of networks. And just trying to kind of flesh out that phenomenon, that relationship, because it's a relationship that certainly exists. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I personally wanted to know more about, what does this look like on the ground? How is it that, I can only assume MI5 did put some of these storylines into these TV shows before 7/7 and after 7/7. I mean, that's something, sorry to sort of loop back, but even after 7/7, this process continued, this process of sort of hyping diversionary conspiracy theories, but also hyping the official version at the same time. That continued for at least 2-3 years after 7/7 as well, in terms of the TV shows. So it isn't just a predictive process, it's also a reflective, after-the-fact process. And I just wanted to know more about what that looks like and how that actually operates, and what the mentality is within the security services that leads them to do all this. Why are people who are so obsessed with secrecy also so obsessed with their public image? That's a question that I want to know the answer to.
Yeah.
So I set up spyculture.com to start, cataloging all the documents and all the different sort of bits of information I had about this, and also to review some things and try and show people some examples of how this actually works. So that's what Spy Culture is about. Yeah.
Very good. All right. So lots of great material from Tom Secker. Of course, investigatingtheterror.com, the new website, spyculture.com. And for details on your new book, Secret Spies in 7/7, how does one go about purchasing and acquiring this book?
Well, you can. I mean, you can just search for it. If you want the ebook, you can go to all the usual places: Amazon, iTunes, Barnes and Noble, all of them. The ebook is available on all of those. If you want the paperback, it's only really available through my investigatingtheterror.com website. But if you go to either investigatingtheterror.com or spyculture.com, you'll see on the front page there's a link to the page that's about the book, and that also has a how to buy it, how to buy the paperback, and also links to the various places where the ebook's available. So if you go to either of my main websites, you'll see on the homepage a little thing saying Secret Spies in 7/7, the new book by Tom Secker. You just click on that, and that will take you to the page that tells you all you really need to know.
Yeah, and a personal note there, with the paperback, as I was saying with the bookshelf, it's always nice to just be able to pull something off the bookshelf, especially as a reference piece. It's like to jog the memory, just pull it right off. You have it in your hands, you look through it. So definitely something to be said for the paperback, in my opinion. And the ebooks are great too. So whatever works best for you, whatever you think is good, check out the book. And so thank you to the audience. And I want to, of course, thank you, Tom, for coming back on the show. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been great having me on. Thanks for having me on. It's been great talking to you again, Aaron. And please, if you are interested in all this, this isn't just about 7/7 itself. It's about, as we've just been discussing, it's about a lot of other stuff as well. So there is a lot in this book. So please, if you are interested, please get a copy. I'd greatly appreciate it.
That's right. investigatingtheterror.com. And as always, I want to thank everybody for listening. This is Transresistor Radio. I'm Aaron Franz. Seeker, seek on.